Hi, welcome to the final session of Extending and Expanding Notions of Family in the Interpersonal and Family Communication Classroom. I'm Jimmie Manning, Professor and Chair of Communication Studies at the University of Nevada, Reno. And this particular session, number 5, is on critical interpersonal and family communication studies. And I'll talk a little more about what those are later. But there are two goals for this session. First, to examine 4 readings that present the ideas behind the critical interpersonal and family communication movement. And you'll notice there that I use CIFC, which is a common abbreviation for critical interpersonal and family communication studies that is used in a lot of the literature. And then movement is in quotations because this isn't so much a movement in the sense that it's officially being organized, but in the sense that a lot of scholars have really turned to critical perspectives to do their interpersonal and family communication research over the past 10 years. And so it does appear that we're moving towards some kind of critical turn in the field. And then also I'll provide an activity and an assignment. The assignment is a paper assignment that's really closely aligned with CIFC studies, but the activity can be used in other contexts as well. It doesn't rely on using critical interpersonal and family communication studies. And so if at some point you realize that you're really not into the critical interpersonal and family communication studies thing, you might forward to that activity, which is at the end of the video. All right, so getting into goal number 1 and looking at the readings, the first reading in your packet for this session is a reading from Beth Suter, and it's actually an introduction to a special issue of the Journal of Family Communication on critical family communication studies. And so that introduction is called Critical Approaches to Family Communication Research, Representation, Critique, and Praxis. And so one of the things that this article does really well is it provides a rationale for why critical family communication studies are needed and examines how there's a shortage of this research and gets into some of the specifics of what this research does. And along those lines, another prominent feature of this article is that it introduces what is now commonly referred to as the CIFC Heuristic for critical theorizing in interpersonal and family communication studies. And so in this article, she's actually looking at it mostly as a family communication thing, but later it gets expanded more into the interpersonal domain. And what that heuristic covers is 4 different commitments that are there for critical interpersonal and family communication scholarship. The first is an attention to issues of power. The second is the collapse of a public-private binary. The third is resistance, critique, or transformation of the status quo. And then finally, there's author reflexivity. And all of those are pretty self-explanatory in terms of what they are, but I do want to note that this collapse of the public-private binary is something that is probably especially salient to family communication studies, as a lot of what families perceive as being private is actually made very public, and vice versa. The things that are public and that shouldn't be a part of family life, often they kind of collapse into each other. And then another note, in terms of author reflexivity, a lot of times that's not just thinking about, a lack of objectivity from a researcher and that there's really this impossibility to bring in an unbiased and objective stance, but also thinking about what is the position of the researcher and who are they and what do they represent and what kind of assumptions do they carry with them as they go in to do a particular research study or to do some theoretical work. And so that's the heuristic that a lot of people are using for critical interpersonal and family communication studies. And so that is, especially if you're teaching critical interpersonal and family in a graduate seminar, you really want to include that reading so they can get an idea of kind of what's driving that research. For that special issue, the other editor for the issue, Sandra Faulkner, also wrote an introduction, or as it's called in the journal, an editorial, and it's called 10, The Promise of Arts-Based Ethnographic and Narrative Research in Critical Family Communication Research and Praxis. And in this article, Sandra does several things, and I'm going to point to 2 of them that are especially relevant to teaching family communication from a critical perspective. And the first is that this is a great example of arts-based research. And so one of the elements of kind of the critical movement is that there's less worry about essays following a rigid format and method, while there should be some kind of rigor to it and there should be some kind of accountability to that method. It's less based in so much following instructions to get to a certain end and more based on the idea that you're thinking, you're examining different ways of knowing. And so arts-based research does exactly that. And the name's kind of self-explanatory there. It's research that has an artistic element. You know, we talked a little bit about that in session number 4 when we looked at Robin Boylorn's Sweetwater book. Second, the article shows the novel ways multiple research worlds can be combined. And so in addition to several different kinds of artistic genres being represented in this article, one of my favorite elements is that there are footnotes throughout the article that take you into a more traditional academic read or discussion of extant literature or concepts or theories. And so what you have is kind of this nice way of laying out a story which kind of embraces that artistic side, but using those footnotes so you're not putting the citations in and interrupting the middle of the story to kind of guide readers down to, when they're ready for it, a more academic discussion. So it's kind of clever or novel the way that she's combining those research worlds within the essay. And so those are two that you definitely want to take a look at if you're new to critical interpersonal and family communication studies, because they set up a lot of what we think about and ways that we can think about doing CIFC work. But then later on, about 3 years later, Julia Moore and I wrote an article called "What Counts as Critical Interpersonal and Family Communication Research? A Review of an Emerging Field of Inquiry." And so as we started noticing all of these different articulations of critical interpersonal and family communication research coming about, people actually doing research studies related to critical perspectives in interpersonal and family communication, we wanted to bring together a sense of kind of where are we going in this movement, and really what are we doing with critical work. And so one of the themes we note is that a lot of times people would kind of try to define what is critical and what is not. We tried to actually get away from that a little bit in this essay. And so 3 features of this article. The first is that it provides a comprehensive overview of all the recent CIFC scholarship. And so we look at how they're conceptualizing critical. We look at some of the arguments they're making about critical interpersonal or family communication research. And then in addition to looking at the pieces that are talking more about that critical work, we also looked at actual research studies that were doing critical things, and we brought them in to be a part of that conversation. And so sorted through the research articles, sorted through the conceptual pieces, and tried to get at this idea of what are these politics that we're actually working with and that are involved with the critical interpersonal and family communication study. And so we identified 5 different politics. There was identity politics, which looks at how people's identities and oftentimes the bodies that accompany those identities are marginalized. There's deconstructive politics, which is this idea that you're kind of pulling back the layers or taking something apart to kind of show that the there isn't there, so to speak. And so like one common example of that is heterosexuality. A lot of critiques point out how heterosexuality, or the idea of this perfect heterosexual being, isn't really there. And so queer theory kind of deconstructs the idea that heterosexuality is this perfect real thing. There's economic politics, which looks at the power that money has to kind of assert control or authority, or to trap people into systems of production that lead up to the economic benefit of others more than they lead up to the person who's contributing a lot of that labor. There's technological politics, which looks at the power that people have through technology and how technology can be used to deceive, technology can be used to watch. And so there are all sorts of different technological politics that come together to look at how technological developments or technological tools can be used as a form of power. And then finally, there's affective politics, which get at emotions, feelings, sensing, being. And so affective politics really look at kind of how intensities and emotions pass from body to body, and how those can be used in ways to assert power or to keep power over people. And so if you get into the article, I know I went over those really quickly, it'll really go into those in depth and kind of lead you to other resources that you can look at related to those politics if you're interested in learning more about them. Getting back to the features of the article, another feature is that it interrogates critical as a word, as well as critical topics. And so getting back to the title of that article, we found that a lot of people were kind of trying to assert their version of critical. And what we want to point out is perhaps trying to define critical in the context of interpersonal and family communication scholarship is a pretty much futile exercise, because there are going to be different forms of critical and different takes on it. And getting back to those politics, those are probably what's more important than trying to figure out what we mean by critical. Plus, there's lots of different ways to think about critical. There's a critical tradition, there's a critical paradigm, there are critical theories. And we explore this idea that there are even critical topics. But at the same time, we point out that while there are common topics that tend to be looked at and explored by critical scholars, at the same time, we don't want to paint particular topics into having to be critical. And so that's particularly relevant with identity politics. And so, for instance, do we always have to study people of color in a critical context? We say the answer should be no, because if we say you can only think about racialized bodies in critical ways, that's just another form of oppression put upon those bodies, as you're only allowing one kind of inquiry about them. Or just something that hits home personally to me, if I do an interpretive study of queer people to look at, for instance, how gay men are dating, I don't want someone coming to me and saying, well, you need to go and take a critical stance with that article and apply a critical theory there, because that's kind of trapping those bodies into one kind of scholarship. So that gives you a sense of what that article is about. Moving on to the final article that we'll review for this particular session. This is a delightful research article. It's called Welcome to the Mommy Wars, Ladies, Making Sense of the Ideology of Combative Mothering in Mommy Blogs, and it appears in Communication, Culture, and Critique. And this article is by Jenna Abbott and Julia Moore. And basically, it's an interrogation of this combative mothering culture that is often seen on mommy blogs or discussion spaces, other discussion spaces for mothers. And so this article brings a lot to the table in terms of being able to see just how messed up these blogs can be and how destructive these mommy wars are. And so there's this very nice research element that brings that out. But one of the big benefits of this article is that if you do decide to have a critical interpersonal and family communication unit in your class, this can be an excellent example of CIFC's research, because they can kind of see how there are these empirical findings. But also it brings together many different threads of the discussion related to CIFC, particularly Souter's heuristic, as well as Moore and Manning's politics. And so to give you an example of that, in terms of Souter's heuristic, you can see that this article examines issues of power, particularly in the sense that mothers are kind of fighting for this power. And at the same time, that's also playing into identity politics, which I'll talk about later. It also demonstrates the public-private collapse as something that is considered to be something personal and private. The mommy wars kind of shows you that mothering was never a private thing, that it was always open to public critique and commentary about good mothers and bad mothers and what mothers should do. And in fact, the article is offering critique of that. So we can see three elements of Souter's heuristic coming into play through this article. We can also see several of Moore and Manning's politics coming into play. So the identity politics. So these are mothers, which is one kind of identity, but it also gets back to the notion that mothers are women and that women are the ones that are in these fights, and you're not seeing men in these fights. So there aren't daddy blogs and wars online about how to be a good father in the same way that there are combative mothering experiences that you're seeing online. Also, the article gets into economic politics. And so as Abbott and Moore argue in the article, a lot of this arguing between moms actually serves to promote the companies that sell things to mothers. And so, for instance, this might be mothers fighting over what kind of baby food you should feed the baby. Well, that gets back into the idea of consumer culture and buying the best baby food or buying the best ingredients for the baby food, which actually serves capitalism more than it serves motherhood. And then it gets into the technological politics of who has these spaces, who dominates these spaces online, and kind of how they can use that as a form of power. And then just in general, even if you don't want to go deep into Souter and Moore and Manning stuff, this article is great as an example of feminism and interpersonal family communication if you want to kind of take a more cursory approach to a CIFC application. All right, so I've talked very quickly about critical interpersonal and family communication. Those are a lot of complex ideas and could probably use a lot more unpacking. And so I invite you to check those articles out and just be prepared that some of these ideas take a little time to get through. To that note, one way to get students into an idea presented, particularly in the Moore and Manning article, is what I call the Picked by Politics paper assignment. And so for this assignment, I asked students to review those politics that they learn about from the Moore and Manning article. And in the case of undergraduate students, I actually don't have them read that article, but instead lecture to them about the politics and try to give them concrete examples, and then take the lecture notes and use that to help them with this short paper assignment. And so students are asked to consider the multiple politics of critical interpersonal and family communication, and then to consider one that is especially relevant to their lives. But here's the trick. For this politic, they have to think of everyday mundane interpersonal interactions as a part of that politic. And so for instance, if they were thinking about identity politics and they were a woman student, they might be tempted to say, I'm going to look at makeup ads and how makeup ads make us feel ugly. And so I want to look at the discourse of L'Oreal. For this assignment, I want them to think of their interpersonal interactions. So not a magazine ad that makes them feel that way and makes them aware of how this politic applies to their life, but rather the interpersonal interaction and others who make them feel that way. They must also address how this politic plays out in their family units, communities, and larger culture. And so a lot of them, again, want to turn to that larger culture and say that society tells them or that they receive general messages. But I'm really trying to get them to think about specific communicative interactions from their family, from their friends, from their neighbors that they can think of that ties into this politic and makes it salient in their life. They're limited to 5 pages, not including references, which some undergraduates think is long, but actually once they start writing into this, they find that they have a lot to say, especially as they start to bring in other literatures to start to explain or to get at the that's there with that politic. And then with this assignment, I say that ensuring confidentiality is important because a lot of times students are going to write about very private topics or things that are maybe hurtful to them or highly meaningful to them. And so I want them to know that I'm not going to go and share that paper with the entire class or with other people. It's just between me and them, and unless they want to share it with somebody else. And then it's also helpful to give examples of how these politics play out. And so one very simple example I give is that when I was in college, the town I lived in had one night where a bar turned into a gay bar. And so there was kind of pressure amongst my friend group that on that night we would go out and we would buy a new shirt to wear to the bar. And so that can play into many different politics, but maybe I'll look at the politics of the economic and start to consider how kind of my gay identity was being commodified as I felt like I had to buy a new shirt to have worth and be attractive and to look good at the club. And so that plays into that politic. I could also take it in the direction of identity politics, right? And look at that as a queer identity, right? So there's many different directions you can go with a lot of these. And that's part of the unpacking part of this assignment. So as I do with a lot of assignments, when they turn this in, I like to ask them to share about it if they feel comfortable. And so I start by asking, what are some of the mundane, everyday interactions that make our personal politics visible? And that the way that these politics come into our own personal spheres or our personal lives are made salient by the interactions we have. Also, did you have a hard time picking only one politic? And what kind of overlaps did you see? And so my example about the shirt in the gay bar could be an example where you have 2 kind of different politics you can choose from. And then it's important to discuss with them that oftentimes these politics do overlap and they are constitutive of particular situations where we feel like we need to be empowered or we feel marginalized or we realize that we're a part of a ruse and we're on the losing end of it. But also that gets back to that first question, so what makes our personal politics visible? It's not necessarily that those politics are there and waiting to be unearthed by others' conversation. The interpersonal contributes to those politics and is part of the constitutive makeup of them as well, if that makes sense. And then I also say in this assignment, you picked a personal politic to write about, but the title of this assignment is picked by politics. Why do you think that is? And so that gets at this idea that it's not so much us picking these identities. It's not us picking, the way that we're kind of situated in a large capitalist system and in terms of economics, but rather a lot of times the politics pick us by nature of who we are or our positionality in this world. And so it lets students kind of get into those discussions in a very personal way, right? So they're not thinking about it in abstract ways. They're taking it to themselves and starting to think about where can critical theory be good for me and what can I get out of critical theory. But then also as they hear the stories of other students, they start to realize, wow, that's why even though this doesn't seem like something important to study for me, or maybe, before I just thought people were whiners, now I have a name and a face that I can put this to, and I can understand how this thing or this power imbalance affects someone else's life. All right. Final activity I'll present in this series is the family silence activity, and I will just tell you, this is a student favorite. I have had students stop me on campus and tell me, oh my gosh, I'll never forget the day that we did this activity. It's often mentioned on teaching evals, and so this one's a real winner. And the way it goes is this. I provide each student with a sheet of paper, and then I also make sure that there's a variety of pens and pencils available. That way, if somebody brought a pink ink pen, they're not going to give away their identity that they were writing with that pink ink pen for what they're going to put down. And to that end, I ask students to write down something that their family is silent about, something that everyone in the family knows is there, but that they never bring up or that it seems taboo to talk about it. And then I also make sure they know you're not going to put your name on this. And I tell them other people will read this, so do not include your name. And then once students have had a chance to write about their family silence, I ask the students to fold their paper in half, and then I collect the papers from the students. And then I shuffle and redistribute the papers back to the students. And that way students will most likely end up with another student's paper. But I always warn them, if you get your own, just be quiet. No one will know that you got your own. So just keep it and use it for the remainder of the assignment. And then I ask the students to then form their desk or chairs into a circle where everyone can see each other. And then the students go around that circle, each reading what another student wrote about their family secrets. All right, so after they do that, there's often a silence in the room and people kind of sit there and it's oftentimes very somber. And so the first thing I'll say in response to this assignment is, okay, let's talk about effect. How did hearing your class colleagues read these statements make you feel, right? And so one of the things that I like about this question and that I like about this exercise in general is it's not just about thinking about things, but also feeling it, right? And kind of learning through taking in those emotions and those intensities and understanding how they affect you in more ways than one. And then I also ask, why do you think families keep certain things silent, and what makes it hard for some topics to be talked about? And I'll tell you that a lot of times they start really soft on this, and so they'll say things like, oh, it's just hard, or I don't know, it's difficult, or it's awkward. But eventually, as they continue to talk about it, they really start to release and diagnose and think about, these secrets or these silences that families have. And then I also like to say at some point, let's do a little analysis of what we've heard. What are some of the common themes that we heard, or even common topics? Let's try to figure out some of the commonalities, right? And so this gets them to kind of use the evidence they have to kind of theorize about what's going on here. Like, what seem to be some of the common things that make families silent? Or what are some of the even different feelings or words that were used in describing that? And then at the end, I like to say, okay, let's think about this a bit more practically. Who can we talk to if these silences get too tough to handle? And I think that's a really important question, both ethically, because you might be digging up some stuff that students are thinking about that could be darker to them or that could be hurtful to them. And so it lets them think about, in the context of learning from their peers, who else can you talk to? But it also lets students, kind of acknowledge and release that sometimes they feel trapped and they don't want to share these secrets with anyone. And so I've had students say things like, it was hard enough to write it on this paper. I could maybe do it for this class, but I can never tell someone face to face about this. That's how deeply ingrained the silence is. And so the other thing I'll say about this is sometimes students have a hard time trying to think of something to write down. And so this is another instance where I'll share a personal story. And so the story I share is about alcoholism. And so I tell them everyone in my family knew that my dad was an alcoholic, um, but we were never really allowed to talk about it. We couldn't really discuss it. And so it was just kind of this silent thing we carried with us, and we knew definitely not to take it out of the home, but within the home, we knew we had to be quiet. And so I tell them that story, and I say, you could write all that down if you felt comfortable writing it all down, or you can just make it as simple as my father's alcoholism. All right, so that's it. That is the final session in this series. That is the final activity in this series. We are done. I hope that you found this useful. I hope that you found it helpful. Again, I want to make an invitation. If you have anything you want to share with me, if you have any questions about the material, if I got something wrong, I always want to know that I'm using people's work or thinking about people's work in the way that aligns with how I should be thinking about it. Write me. I'm at jimmiem@unr.edu. That's JIMMIEM@unr.edu. And then remember, you have all sorts of materials that come along with this particular series of web videos. And that includes the other videos, that includes some assignments and activities that are written up, and plus the readings. Thank you all so much. Again, I wish this could have been more of a face-to-face thing, but I'm also excited that I was able to share a lot of the activities that I do. If you have any activities you think I should see, send them along, or if you just want to reach out. I'd be happy to hear from you and to know what you thought about the seminar, or if you, as I said before, if you have any questions. All right, I can probably ramble on forever, but I'll just leave it with saying thank you. I hope that this helped you to think about family communication in some new and interesting ways. I look forward to seeing how you all push me as a field of family communication scholars into thinking about new and different ways of family communication research and studies and perspectives as well. Thank you, and take good care. Bye.